before we have our guest speaker, which she's going to be on at 10:30, we're going to move real fast and do our virtual promotions. We're going to let the cadets know who achieved their achievement and who's pending and all that good stuff. So you want to bring that first slide first, and then we can put all right, this is what we have, and then with each name we're going to show how your certificate it looks and everything, and then it's going to be where we are going to present those certificates to you once we get back together. The first announcement is going to go for Cadet First Lieutenant Patriza. Just to let you know, you were pending on your Achievement 11, and this morning I already approved it, so you are all completed on your Achievement 11. His next step he's moving is for him to earn his Amelia Earhart. The other one that we have is Cadet Camila Rivera Boys. Congratulations in passing your Wright Brothers test. You are pending. So you only have about another week to go in order for me to get it approved, and then you will be promoted next week for your Rice Brothers. We're gonna move on to Shania Rodriguez. Congratulations on finishing your Achievement 3 and finishing your Rice Brother. So congratulations on your last achievement for your Rice Brother. You have moved up to be promoted as a Cadet Staff Sergeant. So keep up the good work and start working on your Achievement 4. To Cadet Velez, congratulations on her Rice Brothers for her Cadet Staff Sergeant. Start working on your Achievement 4. I see you already did your leadership, so finish your aerospace test and you'll be done your Achievement 4. We move on to Cadet Rojas. He finished his Achievement 1, so he got promoted to Airman. And he finished his Achievement 2, in which he is pending to get promoted to his second rank. The same way goes for Cadet Hernandez. He finished his Achievement 1, so congratulations on that promotion for your Airman. He finished his Achievement 2, so he is pending on that one in order to get promoted to his Senior Airman. Cadet Espinal, congratulations in your finishing your Achievement 1. So you are promoted to your Airman. Make sure you keep an eye on that voucher. Let your mom know. And if she has any problem in trying to use that voucher, she can contact us and we will help her. And you can start working on your Achievement 2. Cadet Smalls, congratulations in finishing your Achievement 1. So you got promoted to Airman. Congratulations in finishing your Achievement 2. So you are pending on your Achievement 2. So we will let you know when you are promoted to your second rank. So congratulations. Make sure you work on that, and let's make sure you get that next high award from Silver Air Patrol. So for everybody that achieved promotion and passed their achievements, congratulations on doing that, and make sure you keep up the good work. And hopefully, like I say, we can get back together as soon as this crisis move on. I had a question that somebody texted me about these missions, and let me make this clear, because we don't want you to keep you out. There are 5 actual missions right now running in New Jersey on this COVID-19. The people who can participate on these missions are as follows. All senior members can participate on these missions. Cadets at the beginning, no cadet was allowed to participate. Then it changed. They are just permitting cadets that have the age 16 and above. 16 and above can participate on these missions that's going on right now on this COVID-19. So I know we have cadets that they are younger and they contact me. They like to be part of it. But at this time, no cadets between the ages from 12 to 15 can participate on these missions due to the factor of COVID-19. If anything changes, we will be notified and I will let you know. So any cadets that are 16 and above, you want to participate on these missions, you can let me know, but you must have your GS completed and you must have your uniform. So if you have any questions on this, make sure you notify your deputy commander for cadets, or you let your first sergeant know or your cadet commander know that you are interested so he can pass it up the chain of command. Any questions on that so far? Don't hear no questions, so I'm gonna pass it over to the cadet commander. You got 5 minutes if you want to say something or give a preview of what you want to talk after our guest is introduced and he finishes class, and then it will be the cadet time. So you got the next 5 minutes to let the cadets know and what you and the first sergeant are going to be talking about. And then once you finish, you can pass it to Lieutenant Rickner, and he should be introducing our final guest of the day. You got the floor, Cadet Commander.
Okay, good morning, everyone. So, after the guest speakers, done talking and everything, I'm gonna have a video of what encampment looks like. So, for anyone who was planning to go to encampment this year or maybe the next year, then here's a video so you all know like how to prepare, what you're expected to do. After that, I'm going to be sharing a bit of my own experiences when I went to encampment, and then you also have the opportunity to ask any questions that you need to ask.
You have the floor, Lieutenant Rickner.
All right, I'd like to introduce a very good friend of mine, Aerospace Engineer Sergey Galkin. Sergey.
Thank you very much, Kevin. I appreciate the introduction. And guys, can you hear me? Just give me a thumbs up if you can. All right, perfect. So, Lieutenant Richter and I were kind of discussing your curriculum, and I saw that you guys have a section dedicated to manned spaceflight in kind of the current state. So I figured that a discussion on a more in-depth discussion on the International Space Station would probably be of interest to you folks. So just kind of decided to throw together a small pitch about life on the International Space Station, a bit of a more in-depth look. Next slide, please, Kevin. So who am I and why am I qualified to talk about this in the first place? So my name is Sergey Galkin. I'm an aerospace engineer, like Kevin said. I graduated from Rutgers University back in 2012. Since then, I've had a bit of experience in the aerospace industry. I worked at Boeing and Pratt & Whitney for a little bit. And I also spent 2 years as a biomedical flight controller for the ISS program. During that time, I definitely got to experience a lot of things associated with manned spaceflight, meet some very great, interesting people, and I figure I'd be able to share this experience with you today. Next slide, please, Kevin. So, about the International Space Station. Can anyone here give me just a rough estimate? How long do you guys think it's been up there? Has it been 10 years, 15 years? What do you guys think?
25 years.
Not that long, unfortunately, but close. So it's actually been 20 years this year specifically, and this year it's been 20 years where we've had a continuous presence in space. So just think about it this way: we've had somebody up floating in space, constantly working on the ISS for the last 20 years. The first module, though, were actually these two, Zarya, also known as the Functional Cargo Block (FGB), and Node 1 Unity. So Zarya was built by the Russians as kind of a follow-on to their Mir space program, and Unity was designed by Boeing and built in Italy and then launched on the space shuttle. So as you can probably see already, we're getting this international aspect pretty much going since the very beginning of the program. So Zarya launched in 1998. Node 1, or Unity, launched very soon after. And the very, very unique thing about these particular modules is that they've never before been connected on the ground. So the first time that these modules were made, it was actually up in space. So that's why the designs had to be extremely precise, the machining, all the connections had to be routed very, very properly on the ground to ensure that there is an adequate connection up in space and that we won't need to bring anything back and have to fix anything back on the ground. That would be very expensive. So since then, like I said, we've had a constant presence in space for over 20 years, or almost 20 years at this point. So far, we've had 239 astronauts from 19 countries visit the space station and counting. So next slide, please. So this is what the space station looks like today. Kind of see if you can figure out where the original two modules were located, because they're still there, actually part of the core structure of the space station. So you can kind of try and figure out where they are. And while you do that, I'm going to give you some quick facts about it. So right now with the ISS program, there are 15 countries that are members of this program. They either have some role in experiments or in hardware design or hardware construction. The big players, of course, are the United States, Russia, Canada, Japan, and the European Space Agency, which consists of a number of different countries over in Europe. So the space station orbits the Earth every 90 minutes. So it makes about 16 orbits in 24 hours. So just to put that in perspective, that's 16 sunrises and 16 sunsets. So every 45 minutes, you get either a sunrise or a sunset, which I can definitely say wreaks havoc in your circadian rhythm. So sleep takes a little bit of adjusting to on the ISS, but you know, astronauts are fully capable of that, and they have means of dealing with that. So we can talk about kind of these tactics a little later too. Some other facts: the ISS is about the size of a football field from one side of the solar panel to the other. So that's on the horizontal axis in this picture. And the vertical axis in this picture, like the central structure, that's actually the habitable volume. So that's the pressurized volume where the astronauts live and work. And it has enough space inside for as big as about a 6-bedroom house. So, by the way, guys, if at any point in time you have any questions, definitely feel free to raise your hand, interrupt, and I'll do my best to answer. Next slide, please. So the current crew today, as of today, right now on the International Space Station, is Expedition 63 crew. They are Space Station Commander Chris Cassidy. He is a NASA astronaut, and he's also a former Navy SEAL. This is his third spaceflight. On the Russian segment, you have Anatoly Ivanishin. He was a fighter pilot in Russia. He flew MiG-29s and Su-27s, and this is also his third spaceflight. And you have rookie astronaut Ivan Wagner. This is his first spaceflight. Prior to that, he worked as an airspace engineer for the Klimov Design Bureau, which makes jet engines in Russia, and he worked as an assistant flight manager for the ISS program at RSC Energia, which kind of manages the space station program from the Russian side. So right now, we're actually kind of limited as to how much crew we can have up on the ISS. There's been a bit of a delay in the development of crewed vehicles that would be sending astronauts up into space. So right now we're kind of running a skeleton crew up there of about 3 people per mission. So normally we run a contingent of about 6 people, but it's only about half as much at this point. So, next slide, please.
I had a question before you continue. That was my question. That was my question that I was going to ask you. So the maximum of people that can be up there on the space station is only 6 people at a time?
As of right now, yes. I understand that there is work going on to expand that capability to possibly 8 or 9 people, which also means that you need to be including extra life support capacity, you need to be including extra crew rest areas, sleeping compartments. But the record that we've had in space is actually 13. So, and this was right around the time when the space shuttle was at the tail end of the program. Space shuttle usually flies a contingent of up to 7 people. So we had 6 people on the space station and 7 people on the space shuttle. So 13 people total. That's kind of been the largest number of people we've had in space at one time as of right now.
Okay, and my last question I got for you is, I'm pretty sure that the cadets want to know is when you get a chance, just to explain to them what are the type of meals that the astronaut eat up there.
Yes, and that's actually something that we're going to get into a little later. I have a slide on that. All right, next slide, please. So, mission training. The actual training for the mission starts way before first launch. So the training course for the astronaut kind of goes along the lines of once you get selected as an astronaut candidate, you go through 2 years specifically training for the job. So you learn all the basic skills you need to know to be an astronaut. So you learn robotics, you learn spacewalking, you learn how to operate different hardware on the International Space Station that's commonly used. And one of the videos that Lieutenant Richter sent out earlier talked about training in the NBL and safety. So that's definitely part of that initial training as well. You kind of learn how to operate the spacesuit and how to function in the spacesuit. And the water training allows to simulate microgravity very well. The only thing that is extra that is not simulated microgravity is the water resistance. But other than that, if you're neutrally buoyant, so you're not really listing any one way or rising up or coming down inside the pool, you can pretty much get the equivalent feeling of what it's like to do a real spacewalk. And I've actually heard astronauts say that the comparison is pretty much 1-to-1. So it's very similar to how they practice it down on the ground as how they operate up in space. So once you complete your 2 years of initial training, you go into an additional 3 years of mission-specific training. So that's the point at which you kind of start learning the different payloads and experiments that you're going to be working on while you're flying in space. And then in addition to that, you actually learn like mission-specific spacewalk. So for example, if the plan is for you to run a spacewalk to repair a specific piece of hardware, you learn about that piece of hardware, you learn where it's located, how to get to it, what kind of precautions need to be taken to safely repair it, and such factors. So earliest you kind of get to fly after you get selected as an astronaut candidate is at least 5 years. And the point of this whole training is to increase safety. Safety is an extremely large part of NASA culture, especially after some of the unfortunate incidents that we've had in the past. And but also to increase speed, because while you're up in space, your time is very valuable and yours very limited. So what you're going to try and do is make sure that you're progressing through your day as quickly and as smoothly as possible. And that's why you also have a very large ground support team supporting your activities on a day-to-day basis as an astronaut. Because if there's any issues arise, you can talk back to the ground team and you can ask them to resolve some of the issues for you. And the ground team has that remote capability. They're actually capable of communicating to hardware up on the space station. So a lot of the issues can actually be fixed from the ground, which gives the astronauts a lot more time to actually spend working the science and essentially mission objectives. So next slide, please. So after your training is complete, you are getting ready for launch. So right now, the pretty much only way to deliver astronauts to space is through the Russian Soyuz spacecraft that launches out of a town called Baikonur in Kazakhstan, and it launches on a Soyuz rocket. So once you launch, you kind of experience very mild, 3 to 3.5 Gs of acceleration. So nothing too crazy, not as bad as some of the entries we've had where astronauts experienced up to 10 or 11 Gs. So, but 3 to 3.5 Gs, it still kind of puts you start feeling the weight of your body coming down on you. But once you're in space, it takes about 8 minutes to actually reach orbit. So at that point, you're in microgravity. And then from that point, it takes about 6 hours in the best case scenario to reach the International Space Station. Before that, it took 3 days, and the 3-day approach is more of a contingency now in case you kind of miss your launch window or you don't exactly rendezvous in a very well position. But 6 hours right now, it takes some precise timing, and the launch window is small. It's on a matter of minutes. But if you hit that, you'll be able to catch up to you're essentially catching up to the International Space Station, so you'll be able to reach it in less than a day's time frame, which definitely improves astronaut morale, because the Soyuz itself is a pretty cramped capsule and there's not a lot of room to move around. So being stuck in there for 3 days, it's done, but a lot of people don't appreciate that, so they prefer the quicker approach. Next slide, please. So this is kind of what, if you're looking at the International Space Station flight path on a flat map, this is what it looks like. So because we're traveling around the world, here's a question for you. What time frame or what time zone do you think the International Space Station operates in? Takers.
What was that question again?
What time zone do you think the ISS operates in?
Cadets answer.
If you guys don't know, that's fine. Essentially,
Yes, cadets.
Let's give them a chance.
Excuse me. What time zone do they work in?
all right, going once, twice.
Eastern, Western?
Maybe Eastern time.
Excellent guess, but not exactly quite. So that is a great question. So the ISS, a lot of the ISS launches happen from the Eastern time zone, but you also think that the US segment operates from Houston, which is on Central, and the Russian segment operates on Moscow time, which is, Russian Standard Time in Moscow. So the common convention that they decided to kind of adapt is to operate on GMT. So Greenwich Mean Time, which is kind of like the centralized time zone, also known as UTC, Universal Standard Time. So, which actually makes it very great for the Europeans, for that they're actually only about 1 hour away in their mission control room. For them, the schedule is fairly simple. But, I certainly know myself that working out of Houston, I had to pull some overnight shifts in order to kind of match up with the astronaut schedule. But just to talk a little more about the schedule, the crew day is broken down into 5-minute increments. So, and just kind of on the big picture, we try to give the astronauts about the equivalent amount of time as you would get here. So they would get about 7.5 to 8 hours of sleep. And then they would get about, 6.5 hours of work time. And then 2.5 hours of exercise time every single day. And then the rest of the time is kind of their own. But that 6.5 hours of work time, like I said, is broken down into 5-minute increments. So that's why it's very important, going back on the training aspect, to actually train the astronauts on their mission-specific goals very early, prior to the spaceflight, because what that does is that kind of lets them complete their 5-minute activities or 10-minute activities at a fast pace, because they're not kind of stuck thinking and trying to figure out how to complete a certain activity, and by that they're losing the valuable time. So like I said, 2.5 hours of exercise every day, and that is very important. We'll get into that a little later, but that's very important to maintain astronaut health. So while the crew is awake for those 6.5 hours, they are usually in constant audio communication with the ground and also video communication. There are onboard cameras inside the space station that the astronauts can turn on, and that way the ground team can actually keep an eye on the astronauts, what they're doing, and also catch any possible mistakes that they may be making, try and correct them. Or the other part is catch anything that may be kind of floating by the camera. So the one thing about the International Space Station environment is that you have air circulation to kind of filter out CO2. So you have massive air currents inside the ISS, and what that means is that if something comes loose, comes off the walls, or kind of left hanging in the middle of the module, it'll eventually start drifting and it may get lost. So there's actually probably a few nuts and bolts and tools that are probably hidden in different corners of the space station. Yep. I saw a question somebody asked about how long astronauts spend in space, and that's actually a very excellent question. The typical mission lasts about 6 months, so that's how long an increment lasts. And the missions are staggered, so you would get a new crew every 3 months. That way, every 3 months, you would kind of see old faces, and you would be able to rotate down, come back to Earth, debrief, and then so you kind of keep on staggering missions and keep on launching crews every 6 months, and that's why you maintain kind of constant habitability on the ISS. So there is a world record for that. Yes, thank you, Malcolm. The record is 1 year, or actually pretty close, about 360 days. That record was set by Scott Kelly and Mikhail Kornienko. And that was kind of a practice run for a flight to Mars. So we're kind of talk a little bit later about the future of the manned spaceflight exploration, but the flight to Mars is a one-way trip that takes about 6 months. So the way the Mars missions are currently planned is you have 6 months to get there, then you have about a year on the planetary surface, and you have 6 months to get back. So, but there are certain challenges associated with that, and we can talk about them a little later. All right, next slide, please. So, question that was posed about food. Eating food is very a lot of fun up in space because you're in a microgravity environment. But before we even get to the food up in space, we have to figure out what food we're going to eat. So the food selection starts on the ground. So the astronauts actually, before their space flight, they go into a dedicated food lab inside inside Johnson Space Center, which is like kind of the training center for the astronauts, and that's also where mission control is located for the space station program. They have a dedicated food lab that prepares packages and delivers all the food that the astronauts will eat during their time up in space. So the astronauts would go, they would taste their meals, then they would rate their meals that are available to them on a scale of 1 to 10, what they like, what they don't like, and then based on that selection criteria, certain meals will be chosen for them. They will be packaged, sterilized to kill off any bacteria, or disinfected rather, I should say. And then they would be sent to one of the launch sites to be put on the resupply vehicle, and they would go up and would get delivered. So normally the food for the astronauts would actually come on a resupply vehicle before the astronauts would get there. That way when the astronauts actually arrives on the space station, all of their food is ready and available for them to eat. So, the food is an international cuisine because, of course, you know, American astronauts have their own selection of food. Russian astronauts bring their own selection of food. There's actually food exchange that goes on the International Space Station. So because the two, or all these countries, astronauts from all these countries cross-train with each other, they actually go to visit each other's training sites overseas, so in Moscow, in Europe, in Japan. And as a result, they actually get to choose a small portion of food from these other countries that they would bring up with them, or would get delivered to the ISS for them, rather. And then, of course, you know, sometimes the food that they eat, it's very protein heavy, it's very lean, so it's very healthy, but occasionally you kind of like get a craving for something that's a little more tasty. So there's a food exchange that goes up in space, and foods that have a lot of flavor, some sweet foods or sriracha sauce or beef jerky, for example, are very good barter items. So different types of kind of packages that they bring up. You have food that's in cans, which the Russians bring up. They have food that is in essentially the equivalent of MRE pouches that the military uses, and those you can heat up in a conduction oven between 2 electric plates, and after that it's hot and warm and ready to eat. And then you have food that comes dehydrated. So the food kind of gets packaged, and then it gets dehydrated and vacuum sealed. So that way it stores for a very long time. And on board, they have something called a potable water dispenser. So what it is, essentially, it supplies water to the astronauts so they can drink. It can be hot or cold, so they can drink coffee or just regular water if they want. And each dehydrated food item, it actually has instructions on it on how do you prepare the food. So you would hook it up to this potable water dispenser, you'd set the temperature, and you'd set the quantity. Let's say I want, you know, I need 250 milliliters to rehydrate a piece of shrimp cocktail. So the water dispenser dispenses that amount of water. You kind of, you know, move it around, shake it around a little bit to evenly distribute it. And after that, it's warm for you, it's ready to eat, and you get to enjoy your meal. Fresh food does get flown up on resupply vehicles. Usually it doesn't last very long, so kind of the objective is to put it as one of the last items on that vehicle, and then it's one of the first items that come out. And like I said, the food that they normally eat is very protein rich and kind of lean and healthy, so they really appreciate some fresh food that gets delivered. So things like fruits and vegetables, apples, oranges, tomatoes, peppers, they're all kind of crew favorites at that point. And then the other couple of things are bread. So regular bread would produce breadcrumbs, which would be, it would essentially generate possibly electrical contacts where you don't want them, electrical shorts. So instead of bread, they eat tortillas. Tortillas don't crumble, and they are a perfectly good bread substitute. And then salt and pepper. Salt is kind of a flavor enhancer, so they like to do that. You can't exactly sprinkle salt in space, On one hand, it won't come out of microgravity because it's not really gravity controlled. So the salt and pepper underwater solution. So you kind of like squirt it on your food, and then you eat that and you get the same flavor. So food options in space, I saw a question somebody asked. That's an excellent question. They actually get quite a variety. So, you have your standard MRE meals like your, chicken lasagna, beef patty, anything that comes up in cans. It's actually a pretty broad variety. Once again, fresh fruit and vegetables that they see. Some people get creative. So, for example, when the Italian astronaut Paolo Nespoli flew up, you can see that he brought up the necessary ingredients to make pizzas in space. So they would, use their tortillas instead of pizza bread. Unfortunately, you can't exactly do pizza bread in space, but then you still have your pizza sauce, your toppings, anything you want. So they would create personal pizzas in space. They would heat them up in the conduction oven. That way you get a nice warm slice of pizza. It's not exactly the same. That would be like a New York style pizza, but when you're kind of stuck in a confined environment for 3 to 6 months, any kind of variation on food helps. So I understand that they had a lot of fun actually doing these little playthroughs with the food. So, and then the other question I saw asked was, is water wet? So yes, water is still wet in space, but the interesting thing about the water, and actually you can see that in the bottom left picture, is that it behaves differently in space, because over here gravity primarily is the primary force that acts on this water globule or any amount of water. So here it would just kind of lay on the floor, on the table, in a puddle, right? Well, up in space you don't have you have a microgravity environment, but you're kind of limited as to the forces that are acting on this globular water. So the primary force instead of water turns into surface tension. So the surface tension of water essentially prevents it from breaking apart and kind of floating as many different droplets all over the place. So that's why it kind of coalesces into this little bubble. So, and that's why whenever you see videos or you see photographs of astronauts actually playing with the water, you see that they have water bubbles floating around. And essentially they do a lot of fun with them. They put Alka-Seltzer tablets in them or any food coloring. And then eventually what you can do is you can just kind of float up to it and you can drink it. And still tastes perfectly fine. It's very healthy, and like I said, you can enjoy playing around with your food while you're eating it. Okay, next slide, please. So, exercise. Before that question, can you hear music in space? It depends. They actually bring up iPhones, iPads, music playing devices with them. And they like to work while listening to music. So sometimes on space to ground loops, when you listen to them, you can hear them as they're working. That you can hear like sounds of AC/DC, Led Zeppelin, or classical music in the background. But in the vacuum of space, of course, you cannot hear anything because for sound to conduct, you need a medium. So the way sound works over here is that down on Earth is that it actually conducts through air. It causes slight pressure disturbances in the air that then get picked up, and they are received by your ear, by your inner ear and the eardrum, and then that translates to electrical signal through your neurons and into your brain. So that's how you hear sounds over here. But in space, because there's no medium, because there's no air, in a vacuum of space, like if you're in a pure vacuum, you won't be able to hear anything. So, but yes, on the space station, of course, they play music. They like to work to music, so that kind of keeps the day lively. So they actually listen to music while they exercise. And in terms of exercise capability, it is actually a very important factor on the International Space Station. Once again, crew is scheduled to exercise 2.5 hours every single day. The reason why they do that is that because when you're in a microgravity environment, you don't have gravity acting on your bone structure, on your body, on your muscle structure. So the things that the adage of if you don't use it, you lose it, it holds very true here. So because the astronauts aren't really using their legs or kind of their muscles to support themselves in a gravity environment, they start getting bone matter loss. So the calcium in the bones actually starts washing out with urine, and then you start getting muscle mass loss. So in space, you may not need it, but when they come back down to Earth after 6 months, there are a whole number of health risks that are associated with it. So that's why astronauts exercise 2.5 hours a day. And in the US segment, the exercise capability that they actually have 2 pieces of cardio exercise equipment. One is called T2, the treadmill, also known as the Colbert. Story associated with that you can look up online. And then the other one is called Cetus. And Cetus is a stationary bicycle. So going back to the treadmill for a little bit, you know, of course, when you're running in a microgravity environment, it's kind of hard to run because without being any support, because that way you're just kind of push off the treadmill and you float up, and you're not exactly going to be getting any resistance, and you're just going to be hanging out in the mental module, you know, spinning your legs, trying to anyway. So what they do is they wear something called a Glenn harness. It's almost like a modified backpack without the backpack part, but it's a shoulder harness and a belt that then gets clipped to the treadmill and with bungee cords. And these bungee cords are enough to provide a resistance and enough down pull where it'll hold you to the treadmill, and you can actually use the treadmill to get resistance while you're running, and you are exercising your bones and your muscles that way. And Cetus, of course, it's a stationary bicycle, or as the astronauts like to call it, it's a unicycle on a trampoline. It doesn't have a seat per se because you don't exactly need a seat, but you're still using the cycling motion, and that's how you're getting your cardio exercise in that way. The third piece of equipment is for resistive exercise, and that one is specifically for muscle growth and muscle development, and it's called ARED, so Advanced Resistive Exercise Device. So here's another question for you folks. Normally when we do muscle and resistance training here, we use weights because of gravity, but in space there is microgravity, so the weights won't be as effective. So how do you think ARED works? So, any takers? Not takers. Okay, so the answer to that question is it's actually pneumatic. So the equivalent, what you can do is if you have a syringe, and you can take the needle off the needle end of the syringe and cap it, and then when you pull on it, you will see that you sense resistance, and that's because you're trying to pull a vacuum inside this syringe. So ARED works the same way. It has effectively the equivalent of 2 syringes, 2 pistons inside it, but they're very large and they're metal, and they're sealed, so they don't necessarily, when they don't leak, occasionally they may leak, but when they don't leak, they provide enough resistance to essentially do resistive exercise training for the astronauts. And they do all sorts of exercise. They do sumo squats, regular squats, crunches, you know, anything that can kind of keep them in shape and keep them going. And the weight range that they get can be anywhere from, you know, 50 pounds, 45 pounds, which is an empty bar, to almost 600 pounds. So, and I've actually seen some astronauts push out that to the maximum. So, but usually people hang around the 150, 200 pound area. Now, the other thing to talk about is one of the videos that you guys watched is Newton's third law. So before that, question from Manny, can they do push-ups in space? The answer to that is yes, technically, but you would need to be restrained and attached to a piece of hardware. So ARED essentially provides the equivalent of push-up and core exercises in space. But once again, you kind of need to be connected to ARED to be able to feel the resistance. Otherwise, you know, you're pretty much going to be pushing against nothing, and you're not going to be getting any benefit from it. Right, so going back to one of the videos you guys watched was about Newton's third law and how every action has an equal and opposite reaction. So the trick with the exercise is that each of these pieces of exercise is connected to the space station. So, but when you exercise on them, you're causing vibrations. So the question is, how exactly do you manage to keep vibrations away from the space station structure and possibly damaging the space station structure? So if you look at it, each one of these exercise pieces is actually vibrationally isolated from the space station structure. That way you can continue doing exercise, but you're not imparting any extra forces from the space station that it's not rated to and possibly damaging the hardware. So in the Cetus stationary bicycle picture on the right, you can actually see the 2 of the 4 they almost look like cotton balls that connect the frame of the Cetus to the space station structure. They are located at the corner of that gray frame that the bike is attached to. So these are the vibrational isolators for that specific piece of equipment, and they isolate the exercise equipment from the space station structure itself. Okay. All right, next slide, please. So I see questions coming through. This is great. So some of the activities that we talked about already, food, exercise, hygiene. Essentially, when they live and work in space, they do a lot of the same activities that we do here on Earth. But because they're in space, every single piece of activities has a bit of an extra meaning to it. So every little thing has to be accounted for, and a lot of the things that we take for granted here aren't exactly they're not exactly the same way that they are up in space. So for example, we can take washing your hair. So, top left picture is astronaut Karen Nyberg. She's showing how to wash her hair. The trick is that you can't exactly go take a shower in space. So what you have to do is you need to wet your hair before, and remember how water is being held together with surface tension. So the surface tension would attach the water to your hair follicles, so your hair will become wet. Then you kind of, apply shampoo or conditioner in there, and you would just kind of let it soak a little bit, clean it up, and then you would dry it off with a towel. But the thing is that you can't exactly wring out the towel because that'll send water flying everywhere. So what you would do is you would either trash the towel, or in this particular case, all the water would get reclaimed. So you would kind of hang it out next to an air duct to dry, and the water would evaporate from the towel, and it would get sucked back into the air circulation system, and it'll be readily available for use. So that's kind of another factor. Most of the water, if not all of the water, probably about 95% of all the water used in space gets recycled. So that also includes your sweat, your water from when you drink, your water from when you wash your hair, and also any water from any bathroom activity that you may have to use. So it's not exactly the most glamorous piece of spaceflight, but it is a necessity. So one of the questions I saw posed is how do they get their air? So the air on the space station gets recirculated. So there's actually a CO2 scrubbing system that utilizes some of this water that will take this, carbon dioxide out of the air that you breathe out, and it will filter it, and then it will send it back into the space station structure, ready to breathe again. Space station is maintained pretty much same consistency as modern day or current atmosphere here on Earth. So it's about 14.5 psi of atmospheric pressure, and you still have your 79% nitrogen, 21% oxygen mix. Now, in case there is a leak, or in case space station pressure starts going down, there are spare tanks mounted to the outside of the space station that can actually pump oxygen and nitrogen back inside. So you can support a space station life that way. But a leak is one of kind of like the big three emergencies that you can experience on board the ISS. The other two kind of being, of course, a fire and a ammonia leak. So let's see, more questions coming in. This is great. Okay, so the information that we learned from going to space. I was actually going to get to that point. We have a slide on that later, kind of some of the scientific activities that they do. And then I kind of missed the second question. I don't know if you guys can pose that again. So, but I'd love to answer them as they come through. So in the meantime, one of the other things I wanted to talk about is actually cutting hair. So cutting hair in space, as you mentioned, in 6 months, the hair would tend to grow out pretty well. So what you would have to do in that particular case is you need to clean it up, but you can't exactly have hair follicles floating everywhere. Once again, they would cause electrical shorts, clog up the air filtration systems, just be a bad day all around. So what they end up doing is that they actually end up fixing a vacuum cleaner to your hair cutter or hair buzzer. So any hair follicles that are cut, they would get sucked up in the vacuum cleaner, and then you can dispose of them later. So like I said, once again, flying into space, it's kind of like camping, but there are certain precautions and certain things you have to factor into consideration because you're operating in a enclosed environment in a microgravity environment. Yep. All right, next slide, please. Right, so the question as to what kind of information we get from the International Space Station. So this is some of the scientific research that goes on board the ISS. So the ISS is a very unique piece of structure. It is actually considered a national laboratory, and it's a very unique national lab in the sense that it's the only lab that has a microgravity environment in it. So there are benefits to operating in a microgravity environment, doing experiments in a microgravity environment. So that's why astronauts are always constantly busy doing science up there. So before we get into the science, I saw the question was asked, is space anything like the movies? Yes and no. So space is actually a very big inspiration for the movies, but in all the movies that I've seen, I found that a lot of the spaceflight experience is overly dramatized. So in reality, things are actually much calmer and much quieter. Which is actually a very, very good thing, because that way you don't really have people panicking and kind of losing their wits as something goes wrong. So you're capable of completing the mission. You're capable of fixing any problem that may arise, and you're doing this in a methodical, efficient manner, so you can get it done, and then you can move on with your day. So one of the examples that I personally experienced, I was actually on console when we had 2 years ago, we had an air leak. So it turns out there was a hole in one of the Soyuz spacecraft that they were able to discover, but before they found it, it was leaking air out of the space station stack, so the pressure was dropping. Normally, of course, in movies, you would see that it would be a very, very massive, kind of like a life-threatening emergency, and it is. But this particular leak wasn't mild enough where it occurred during astronaut sleep schedule, so the astronauts were asleep. And as a result, we decided not even to wake them up. We told them in the morning when they woke up, it's like, hey, by the way, you guys have a leak in there. All your kind of activities are canceled for the day, so can you guys go ahead and isolate it, find it, and then isolate it, and then fix it. So that's what they did. Kind of destroyed the schedule for that particular day, but the crew, in a very methodical manner, they searched the entire space station structure. They found the leak. They actually have something called an ultrasound leak detector, which generates noise in headphones. The closer you get to the leak, the louder the noise gets. So that's how they were able to find the leak. Spent some time discussing how to fix it. They ended up patching the leak, and our life support system specialist just kept on pumping additional air into the space and stack, so you maintain pressure inside. The leak was fixed, and the crew went on with their day. So nothing dramatic about it. The other question I saw posed was, what is the shortest amount of time somebody can go into space? So 24 hours, unfortunately, is too short of a time. We don't have the capability to kind of go to space on a field trip just yet. Hopefully, eventually down the line, we have people working on it to kind of bring easier access to space flight. But until then, the shortest somebody would go into space is about a week. And that's usually the amount of time to hand over from one expedition to the next. So most recently, we've had a visitor from the United Arab Emirates. It was their first astronaut who flew up to the space station. He flew up with Expedition 61. He ended up staying for a week, and then, he flew up with Expedition 62. Flew up, ended up staying for 1 week there, did a lot of science, did a lot of experiments. Overall, I heard, very, very good things. And then, of course, he came back with Expedition 61 as they were returning home. So, checklists, yes and no. There are certain checklists that will need to be performed, but they're more procedures based. So, every single experiment, every single activity that the crew works on has a procedure associated with it. So they would kind of run through the procedure and then would be checking off steps as they go. And there's, of course, a multitude of procedures because they run a very large number of experiments and maintenance tasks on board. So speaking about experiments, some of the scientific research that they get involved with, of course, very, very large number of categories. So to date, we had about 2,700 research investigations that took place on the ISS alone in the 20 years that it has been flying. So that's about, I'd say, close to about 135 science experiments per year. So, and of course, a lot of these take a long number of time. They last weeks, days, weeks, possibly months. So you get a lot of scientific value and scientific background out of them. So some of the experiments are medical. You talked about why they exercise, about bone muscle loss or bone mass loss, muscle mass loss. So a lot of this research has benefits here back on Earth because, treating osteoporosis in elderly folks, folks, for example, who have to have hip surgery because, they broke a hip bone. What are kind of some of the mitigating techniques that we can use down here that they learned in space to kind of treat the same problem that astronauts would have up in space. Possibly treatment for eyesight loss. One of the things that they've recently learned is that when you're up in space, you have the fluids inside your body. Like right now, we're sitting here on the ground. Our body fluids, our blood is kind of pulled towards our legs. But when you're up in space, you don't have gravity acting on your body, so all this blood and all your body fluids, they kind of evenly distribute themselves throughout your entire body. So what that results in is that you have increased intracranial pressure inside your head, which impacts your eyesight. It actually deforms the back of your eyeball, so your eyesight is ruined. So what are some of the mitigating techniques that you would need to combat that and to fix that and to kind of be healthy in that realm? So, for example, the middle picture here, the black and white you see, it's a crystal growth experiment. So the interesting thing about this particular one is that down here, when you kind of grow protein crystals, that you can fight either cancer viruses or this coronavirus, for example, that's going on right now, you will see that the crystals we grow start getting affected by gravity. So their kind of bottom part gets compressed and it's not as effective. Well, in a microgravity environment, any crystals that you grow, they grow out evenly in all directions because they're not affected by gravity. So any protein crystals that you generate that way, they actually end up helping, being more effective because you can utilize all sides of them, and all sides of them are equally efficient in interacting with other molecules. So veggie experiment, the top right picture, how do you grow food, how do you grow vegetables in a confined space in an artificial setting? So that kind of research is definitely beneficial for when you start going to Mars, because you can't exactly carry 2 years worth of food on your spacecraft. So it's going to be very heavy. So how do you maintain food and how do you grow food in flight so that you can sustain your astronauts' livelihood while they're traveling to and from a distant planet? But it also has applications here, for example, in remote research bases in Antarctica or at mountaintops. How exactly do you grow food and how do you grow fresh food in a place that's not hospitable to farming and irrigation or things like that? You learn different things about combustion. We found out that flames burn differently in microgravity because here you have gravity that is affecting your buoyancy, so that's why you kind of see the flame, like the candle on the very right side of the page, it's going straight up. But the image next to that, you can see that the flame is more spherical because gravity is not affecting buoyancy. So that has a very large impact in rocket propulsion. How do we combust fuel in space? How do we make more efficient rocket engines? That kind of stuff. And then one of the other experiments in this particular picture is called Spheres. It's actually an MIT design experiment that they flew robots, 3 different robots up to the space station. And in a microgravity environment, the robots can actually float around. So they learn things like swarm technology, formation flying of these robots, and also these robots kind of act as personal assistants to the crew, so they can kind of, help them out with some tasks, provide some procedures, that kind of stuff. So definitely a lot of, this is just a small fraction of all the scientific research that goes on in space. So, but there's definitely a lot of research that is happening, and there's a lot of benefits back here on Earth. So, yeah. So the question that I do get asked a lot is, why did we go to space in the first place? What's kind of the benefit of doing that? And one of the things I found out is that not only is it kind of, you're chasing grandeur, you're kind of exploring new spaces, new places rather, to quote Star Trek Space, the final frontier, so to speak, that is very true. But a lot of the technological achievements, a lot of the scientific research that we get as a result of manned spaceflight and the experiments that we do in space have a very large impact back here on Earth. Robotic surgery, for example, was a concept that came out of NASA with remotely controlled robot arms for the space shuttle and the space station, of course. So one of the very, very large kind of achievements of spaceflight is the impact that it has back here on Earth. So, and I forgot to include this particular link, but there's actually a free NASA publication that NASA puts out. So I will let Kevin know specifically what that is and where you can find it, but it's a magazine that NASA puts out every year that lists all the different scientific accomplishments and applications of the NASA scientific research over here on Earth. So, okay. But all right, any questions on the scientific research that's over right now? If not, we can move on to the next slide. And of course, the other thing you absolutely have to have in space is have some fun. So, space microgravity environment definitely lets you achieve a lot of, pretty amazing athletic feats that you may not be here to do on Earth. You definitely have a lot of fun with your food. And of course, one of the other things that people like to do, astronauts like to do, is they like to kind of look at Earth and they like to see what Earth looks like as it's kind of floating underneath them. So that's why the Italians, they actually built something called the cupola module. So a cupola is a very small module, but it has 7 windows. And the astronauts use it as an observation platform. They also use it to kind of watch vehicles arrive and dock. They grab the vehicles with a robot arm, and anything that requires kind of looking to the outside, they use cupola for. So it provides a very, very great kind of viewing opportunity and a vantage post for them on board. So next slide, please. So speaking about visiting vehicles, you actually have quite a number of vehicles that arrive to the space station. So just going clockwise from top left, you have the SpaceX Dragon capsule. You have a Russian Progress, which is a resupply vehicle, provides supplies. You have the Japanese HTV, which is the H-2 transfer vehicle. And you have the Cygnus from the United States. It's designed by Orbital ATK, or currently known as Northrop Grumman. So large number of corporations and organizations involved in making the space station functional and resupplying it. So my question to you is, kind of looking at these 4 spacecraft, which one do you think actually comes back to Earth? So, is it all of them? Is it none of them? Is it some of them? What do you guys think? Any takers?
The one in the right top corner, like the wings on the back.
That is an excellent observation, but no, that one completely burns up. So 3 out of these 4 spacecraft actually never make it back down to Earth. They do burn up completely. The one in the top left corner, the SpaceX Dragon, is the only spacecraft that we currently have that has re-entry capability. So that spacecraft is used to bring supplies up, but also bring things like scientific samples back down, experiment results, possibly any hardware that we want to investigate and kind of see what are some of the effects of spaceflight and microgravity and radiation and vacuum exposure in space. So we would take that from the outside of the space station, we would package that inside this Dragon spacecraft, and we would bring it back down. So the other 3 spacecraft, they all actually end up burning up in the atmosphere. So it's a one-way flight for them. They would come up packed with supplies. They would dock. So the time after the spacecraft docks and before it departs is very busy time for the crew, because most of that time they end up spending doing storage work. So they have to unpack. It's essentially trying to unpack an 18-wheeler in space and take all the supplies and just kind of stuff them around the space station. And then what you do after that is you take all of the trash that you built up over those last few months and you actually pack that back inside this resupply vehicle. And before it departs. So the way you pack the vehicle is very important because it affects your center of gravity. So kind of one of the things you guys talked about is conservation of mass. You know, in the video that you should have watched, Newton's second law is that so while you don't have weight in space, you still have mass. So, and the center of gravity is very important on that particular piece of mass because, for example, if they pack it wrong, it can undock from the space station and it can start tumbling. So, and if it starts tumbling, it can impact the space station, possibly damage the space station structure, or cause a massive rupture. So, nothing good would ever come with that. So, they have to be very careful in how they pack the spacecraft. And then, of course, after that, the spacecraft would undock. It would depart and it would burn up in the atmosphere, burning up all the trash with it. So these spacecraft, they kind of function as resupply vehicles going up, and then they function as garbage trucks coming back down, so to speak. So one more thing about the resupply is that, you know, we talked about food earlier. We talked about how astronauts like getting fresh food. Well, occasionally we treat them. So most of these spacecraft have freezers on board for like free scientific experiments. But if there's room left in these freezers, we actually pack ice cream for them. So occasionally when a resupply vehicle comes up, they would get fresh ice cream with that vehicle. And that's definitely a very joyful day for the crew because they enjoyed that a lot. So, all right, next slide, please. So robotic operations. We talked about some of the things kind of like remote medicine, robotic surgery. So a lot of that function is actually stemming from these particular robotic operations on the ISS. So the space station outside has a number of robots that can be controlled from the ground, so or from inside the space station as well. So the first one, the one on top, is the called Canadarm2. It's also the official term for it is the Space Station Remote Manipulator System, SSRMS. It's used to kind of grapple visiting vehicles and then berth them to the space station, so you would connect them. It's also used to kind of move astronauts around on spacewalks. And the interesting thing about this particular one is that it is capable of walking itself across the space station structure. So you could technically get it to any place that you need to get to on the space station. You can get it to kind of any corner of the space station and do activities in there, in that particular area. So the one on the bottom left is called Special Purpose Dexterous Manipulator, or Dexter. It can also kind of be docked with the Canadarm2, so to kind of expand its reach. But this particular robot is used to perform any routine or minor maintenance task on the outside of the space station. And then also kind of move cargo around. And then the third piece of robotic equipment is the GEM RMS, which is the Japanese external module remote manipulator system. So that's a small arm that you see in the bottom right. It's actually used particularly for the Japanese like external platform, which has its experiments on it. So it's hooked on the shoulder, so it cannot move around, but it definitely kind of grabs things like materials experiments out there, changes experiments out. The GEM module itself actually has a small airlock on it, so you can design and build an experiment inside the space station, put it in the airlock, and then leave it overnight. And then overnight, the flight controllers from Japan would use the robot arm to take the experiment out. They would put it on the platform, they'd take another experiment back in, and then would put it back in the airlock. So the next morning you come up, you open the airlock, you can take it out, and then you can disassemble it or fix it or do what you need to do with it. So, and the other factor about the GEM RMS is that it has a small CubeSat launcher. So what astronauts would occasionally get is that they would get parts for a CubeSat that they would assemble inside the space station, and then they would put it in the launcher and leave it on the airlock. So the Japanese controllers from Tsukuba, Japan, they would use the arm to grab this launcher from the airlock and then point it in a specific direction in space, so that when it actually goes out and does launch, it'll go into a stable orbit and it'll stay up in space for a few days before it deorbits and burns up. So the interesting thing about these particular robot systems is that they are used to perform maintenance tasks on the outside of the space station. So they will be used to complete any tasks that for the most part, they will be the first option to complete any maintenance tasks or any repairs that need to be done. Because, if we don't have to send astronauts out into space, that's going to be kind of the safest place for them to be. So the astronauts would, stay safe and not get exposed to the radiation environment in space, and they would be inside the space station. But if for some whatever reason the maintenance and repair tasks cannot be completed with a robotic system, that's when we have to send astronauts out. So next slide, please. We go for a spacewalk. So EVAs, extravehicular activities. So as one of your videos showed, kind of the safety culture of NASA is that a lot of these spacewalk activities get trained down here on the ground very extensively. For every 1 hour you spend in the spacesuit in spacewalk, you kind of spend 5 hours training on the ground. So, and the whole point of this is you kind of learn how to traverse the space station structure efficiently, how to do it safely, and then how you complete the maintenance tasks that you need to while you're up in space. But just one of the statistics is that up to this day, we've had over 220 spacewalks performed on the space station and counting. So every single mission that comes up does anywhere between 2 and 4 spacewalks to repair any different parts of the space station structure on the outside. They can also be used to kind of swap out external payloads. So, for example, one of the external payloads is the materials research experiment. So you kind of have samples of many materials up in space that you kind of put on the outside of the space station, and you leave it there so that you will see how the different materials react to the environment of space, like the vacuum, radiation, atomic oxygen, sunlight, what have you. It includes like metallic materials, it includes plastics, and you kind of see how some of them deteriorate really fast and others takes a while to deteriorate. So, but going back to the spacewalks themselves are a all-day activity. Spacewalk preparation actually starts a few days before the spacewalk itself. Up on the space station, the astronauts check their equipment, they purge and they clean their life support systems, they pressurize them, make sure that everything's functioning properly. So on the day of the spacewalk itself, the astronauts would wake up, and the first thing they would do is start pre-breathing. So are there any scuba divers in the group, by the way? So one of the things you need to factor into consideration is, as you're a scuba diver, you can get the bends. So if you're kind of swimming at higher pressure environments, you breathe air and nitrogen into your system. So if you start coming up too fast, the nitrogen will come out of solution and will cause bubbles in your bloodstream, and you may have a pretty bad day where you may lose an arm, you might go numb, you can kind of cut off circulation to parts of your body. Well, the same factors actually are applicable in a spacewalk environment, except at the very beginning of the spacewalk. So one of the things is that you're coming from a space station environment, which is, pressurized to 14.5 psi standard atmosphere. It has 79% nitrogen in it. So you are coming from that environment into a pure oxygen environment. So the spacesuit itself, it is a pure oxygen environment, but it only operates at about 4 psi pressure. So much, much lower pressure. So you need to make sure that you purge all the nitrogen out of your system beforehand, so that as you go into this reduced pressure environment, you won't have nitrogen coming out in bubbles from your bloodstream. So the reason why the spacesuit is actually at such low pressure is any higher pressure, and it tends to expand. So, if you can imagine what it's like to be inside a rubber balloon, and you're kind of trying to bend your arms, and you're fighting against the balloon and the pressure inside the balloon, because the balloon wants to keep on expanding, but you still need to complete your tasks and your objectives. So that's what being inside a spacesuit is. So one of the things I heard is that astronauts get very tired in terms of their gloves and in terms of their fingers, like their arms get tired, because every time they have to, squeeze a fist or grab a tool, they're not only fighting to kind of like the muscles to squeeze their fingers, but they're fighting the glove as well, because the glove wants to expand in this pressure environment. So EVAs themselves, once they get out the door, they usually last about 6.5 hours. Sometimes they last longer. There's, depending on how quickly they use their batteries, how quickly they use their oxygen and their CO2 scrubbing equipment. So for those 6.5 hours, imagine just doing a very, very heavy workout for that time. And the downside is all you get, unfortunately, you get no food for that time and you only get about a quart of water. So that's why astronauts, they kind of have to be very fit. And they have to be able to kind of ration this water for the duration of that 6.5 hours so that they don't get tired. So, and these guys are, like I said, they're in stellar shape. They are very, very high performance individuals. So usually the person itself is not the limiting factor. It's usually the equipment. So most of the times the reason why we have to call EVAs is because either A, we're running low on oxygen regeneration and need to bring it back into the airlock, or we're running low on battery. It was never because an astronaut is feeling tired and he's unable to complete his work. So one of the things, we talked about conservation of mass in space. When you're moving a heavy piece of equipment, if you're, for example, if you're swapping out a tank or an electrical box up in space, that piece of equipment doesn't have weight, but it still has mass. So, and it can get away from you really fast. It's the difference between picking up and moving something very light, like this, USB drive, for example, and picking up and moving something very heavy, like piece of an electronics box. So, it still has inertia. So, I can take this flash drive and I can just kind of move it, and it doesn't have inertia, so I can stop it very easily. But in space, even if it's weightless, if I pick up that big electronics box and I start moving it, it still has immersion. So if I can get it up to a certain speed, I actually won't be able to stop it because it's heavier, or it has more mass rather, so it has more inertia, so it wants to keep going still. So I need to apply more force to actually stop that particular box. So that's one of the things that spacewalkers have to face in space. So if they're swapping out a piece of electronic component, or if they're swapping out air tank or a nitrogen tank or something like that, it's too heavy for them. So if they get it moving, they have a hard time stopping it. So that's why where the robot arm comes in place, where you usually have one astronaut suspended on the robot arm, and he acts more like a grappling hook. So what he would do is he would hang on to this piece of equipment. The other astronauts would disconnect it, and then there's actually a crew member inside that controls the robot arm. They can pick up this astronaut that's hanging onto this piece of equipment with the equipment, and then move them to whichever part of the space station that needs to go to. So it's a very, very, it's kind of like a ballet. It's very choreographed. It's very, but there's a lot of moving parts to it. So it's interesting in the sense that there's a lot of training that goes into it, and it's very involved. But the end result, of course, is you're sustaining the life capability, and you're maintaining the space station so it can last longer. So one of the kind of big, more recent accomplishments is there's an external payload called an alpha magnetic spectrometer. So it's actually a astrophysics payload that was only designed to last a certain number of years, less than 10 years. It's been going for over, I think, 12 at this point. And the amount of science that it brings back, just kind of on the cosmic microwave background, on like the astrophysics phenomena, is very broad. It's you have a lot of science that's coming back on it. So the decision was made to kind of try and extend the lifetime. It had issues with its cooling system. So one of the more recent, most recent spacewalks that were performed were designed to repair the cooling system on this payload. So they were successful. The cooling system was repaired, and this piece of payload is actually providing a lot of really useful data to this day. So it was a very big accomplishment that happened pretty much December and January of that just recently passed around the Christmas and New Year's time frame. So, okay, we're almost done. I understand we're running low on time, but just a few more slides. So next slide, please. So after your mission is complete, you spent 6 months up in space, you go through landing and recovery. So you go back in the same spacecraft that you came up with most of the time, which is the Soyuz spacecraft. And by the way, while you're up in space, the Soyuz spacecraft acts as your lifeboat. So in case you ever need to abandon the space station for whatever reason, it's a pretty bad day if you need to, but you will be able to get back into your Soyuz and then fly down using that particular spaceship. But the Soyuz spacecraft, it's a three-part spacecraft. You have a kind of a docking adapter, you have the adapter that re-enters, and then you have the service module that has all the equipment, electronics, propulsion tanks, etc. So only the middle part of that spacecraft comes back. So it's just enough space to kind of fit three astronauts and then any small samples that you may want to return. Usually it only takes a few hours after you undock from the space station to come back down and land on Earth. You land back in Kazakhstan, just only a few hundred miles away from the place where you launched, and you come down on parachute. And then during re-entry, usually it's pretty simple. You also experience about 3 Gs, so nothing too strenuous. But after spending 6 months in space, even 3 Gs, literally feels like a literal ton that's kind of coming down and pushing on you. So I've heard astronauts say that one of the things that they experience is, as you're coming down on re-entry, you can actually start feeling the weight of your arms again, your legs again, and you have to consciously apply effort to move your muscles to lift up your arm, or you kind of, do any task that you need to perform. So after you land, your job's not done. You actually have to go through about 3 to 6 months of rehabilitation. So you are getting used to being on Earth again, to functioning on Earth again, dealing with gravity again. One of the things that astronauts also experience is loss of depth perception, because you're always in an enclosed environment for 6 months. So I've heard astronauts say things like, you're walking down the hallway and you need to turn a corner and you run into the corner because you misjudged the distance, or you misjudged the distance the other way and you run into the opposite wall. So it's just kind of, being, getting used to being on Earth again. It's takes a little bit of time, but usually by about 3 to 6 months, they're back to where they were, and then they can start training for their next mission. So, yeah. All right, next slide, please. So just kind of some of the future outlook. So before we get into that, excellent question posed, how do you sleep in space? So the sleeping in space is actually it's hard to describe. So, but I've heard astronauts describe it as they're kind of not being, it's like laying on a very, very soft cushion to the point where you literally don't feel your weight. So that's kind of because there's no, you don't really feel an up or down in space because there's no gravity to tell you which way is up and down. So what they do is that in one of the space station modules, Note 2, they have 4 sleeping compartments, and there's 2 more in the Russian segment. And what they do is they're arranged in a circle around the circumference of that particular module. So you have 2 modules that are standing upright vertically, and then you have 2 modules that are horizontal, but one's almost like on the floor, so to speak, and one's on the ceiling. But when you're sleeping in them, you kind of don't really feel, up or down. So you're very comfortable. And what they do is that they actually sleep in sleeping bags that have holes cut out for the arms. So you kind of like crawl into that, you zip it up, and you're kind of hanging out. Your arms tend to float upwards a little bit, but in microgravity, but it's a very comfortable sleeping position. So they actually have these like dedicated crew quarters to them. They're ventilated. They're kind of small. They're kind of like cubbies, but it's enough where you have some of your own personal space. So you can sleep, you can chat with family. They have, each one of them has their own laptop in there. They have some personal belongings like family photographs that they bring up with them, or any items that they kind of feel hold a special significance to them. So usually that's kind of how you sleep, and that's kind of their personal lives in space, so to speak. So kind of looking out on the future of manned spaceflight and the space program, you have a number of programs that are coming up. You have the commercial crew vehicles that are supposed to be, they're supposed to start bringing astronauts to the space station today. So you have Boeing CST-100, and then you have the SpaceX Dragon 2, and the SpaceX Dragon 2 was actually just recently announced they were going to launch the first 2 astronauts to the space station in end of May. So definitely keep an eye out on that. That should be an interesting time. Beyond that, the next step of the space station program, we actually have something called the Lunar Gateway. You can see a concept in the bottom left. It is actually going to be a small space station that's going to be orbiting around the moon. And you would use the Orion spacecraft, which is a spacecraft that's currently shown in that picture, to fly from Earth to the lunar orbit, and you would dock with it. And that space station will be used to conduct war experiments as well as control robotic operations on the moon. So if you have kind of robots that are down on the lunar surface, you'll be able to control them from there. And then, of course, eventually it'll be used as a staging area to bring humans back down on the lunar surface. So you will be able to kind of fly astronauts to the space station. They would be able to transfer to a lunar lander and then come down to a lunar base and do experiments there. And then eventually to Mars. You know, we have new spacesuit prototypes and new habitat prototypes and rover prototypes that are currently being developed that will make their way to Mars, and it'll help with exploring the Martian surface and then beyond that, of course. So in the top right, for example, you can see the next prototype of a planetary surface exploration spacesuit. It's something that we haven't done since the 1960s and the Apollo days, but we're definitely kind of, you know, working our way to going back there. So, next slide, please. Okay, if you want to see the space station fly overhead, there's a number of resources that are available to you. One, of course, is spotthestation.nasa.gov. The other one is heavensabove.com. That website is actually very good because you can input your location and then you can select what spacecraft you want to watch. And for the space station, it's very, very bright in the sky, especially right around the times of sunrise and sunset, because you know, you still have, at that altitude, you still have light shining and reflecting on it, so you can see it against the dark sky very well. And this website will tell you which direction it's coming from, how high is it going to be, and also how bright it's going to be. And if you want to see some live views from the space station on board cameras, you can go to that Ustream link. And the good thing about that one is that occasionally they actually patch space-to-ground audio in there as well, so you can listen to astronauts talk to the ground teams and vice versa. So, okay, next slide, please. So, are there any more questions? Well, folks, thank you so much for your attention. I really appreciate this opportunity to talk to you and just kind of share some of my passion about manned spaceflight and some of my previous work experience. Feel free to reach out to me with any questions you may have. Lieutenant Richter has my contact information, and I will be sure to get that magazine to you. It's called NASA Spinoffs. I just remembered the name, but it will kind of show you what some of the impacts NASA and space exploration is having on our world, on Earth here today.
Awesome. I'd like to thank you very much for coming into our meeting.
It was my pleasure. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, sir. All right, let's take a 10-minute break, and then we're going to give the floor to the flight commander, the first sergeant, so he can talk to the cadets and bring whatever he needs to bring up. So let's break for 10. Flight commander and the first sergeant, this is your time. So you got the cadets online. Just find out, you know, how they're doing and all that. You know, that's all we want to hear. You guys being involved with the cadets. If the cadets got anything, they gotta get back at you. This is the time for you to talk back and forth. So you guys have the floor. So go ahead and do your thing. When you guys are done with all your thing, then just let us know. So Fiella's the flight commander, the first sergeant. The floor is all yours.
All right, Pastor Teresa and Roman, anything you guys want to talk about or anything, questions, etc.?
First I want to ask a question to all the cadets and see how everyone's doing right now. Okay, so any cadets can answer right now. You don't have to type it, you just say it. I just want to see how everyone's doing right now. Okay, so does anyone have any questions about that video of encampment that we played earlier?
Are those videos and pictures from last encampment, or was it like a collective over the years?
So that was a video from, I believe, 2016 or 2017.
Looks like it says 2016 on it. But however, though, you can see different types of like encampment videos if you go on YouTube. Like for example, they have the one that I went to. I think was 2011. It's almost about the same. I know like every year they usually try to change a little bit of things, but it's about like a routine.
Okay, so now I'm gonna be sharing with you my experience when I went to encampment. So if any of you have any questions while I'm speaking, you can just ask. So when I was first going to encampment, in my mind, I thought everything was gonna be like fine. I thought I was ready for what was about to happen. But after getting there, I was not ready at all. So when you go to encampment, you're put in a flight. When I went there, I was in alpha flight. So everyone in your flight is basically your partners, they're your team. So when you get to encampment, it's all about like teamwork. When you go, you have to make your beds. There will be like room inspections. So all of you, before the cadet staff come in and give you like a roof inspection, you can like inspect each other first, make sure it's good, because when they come and they inspect your rooms, they will look for the smallest details. There are a certain way they have to put everything in your locker. They'll look in your locker, they'll make sure everything's correct. And during days, like 2 or 3 days into encampment, I did not want to be there anymore. Every night I would like count how many days were left. Like, okay, there are only 3 days left, 2 days left into the final day. I kept saying that. But when you get a little bit more into the week, it's actually not that bad. You get used to it. You make a lot of friends there because all of the cadets that are with you, they're your team. So every morning when you wake up, the first thing you do when you wake up is PT. So you wake up, you put your PT uniform on, and then as soon as you've done, then you have to go outside of your room onto the wall. So I started waking up before the cadet staff came in and told me to, because the room I was in, that was towards the end of the hall. So usually the cadet staff, they walk into your room, turn the lights on, and then they wake everyone up and then shut the door. When they were shutting the door, that's what woke me up. And then I would just lie there waiting for them to walk into my room saying to get up. So we would do that. During your encampment, there's a lot of tours. There's a lot of fun things they'll have planned for you. So we went on a tour of like a museum. We had like a day that was full of like physical competitions. So there was a competition in like push-ups, sit-ups, a tug-of-war contest, and yeah. During the whole week, you're working on drill, you're learning aerospace. It was all good. And when you get into the week, the cadet staff, they start having fun with the cadets. But I'm not going to share everything that they did, so it could be a surprise for you when you get there. But one thing they did is that when we went to encampment, we had to take showers. The showers are like, you get into the shower, it's like about 30 or 40 seconds. Then they stop, they turn off the water, and they're yelling, everyone out, it's time to get out. So one time when we had to go to the showers, they stuck up red alien. It was a balloon that you had to fill up. So they stuck that in the ceiling. And for anyone to take a shower, everyone had to salute to the alien before taking a shower. So after that, at the end of the encampment is graduation. So you'll have your blue uniform. It's like a big ceremony. You'll all be marching. And that's pretty much the end of encampment. But some of the tours and activities that were planned for us during my encampment were canceled because while we were there was a storm.
I wish you all the best.
That kind of like the power went out, and yeah. But when you're done encampment, it's kind of different because you kind of want to go back to encampment. You don't want it to be over. So, any questions about that?
How did you feel about working with other cadets that you didn't know?
Could you repeat that?
How did you feel about working with cadets that you didn't know?
So, at first I was nervous because, well, I had no idea who they were, never saw them before, so I didn't know what to expect. But when you start encampment, you just kind of have to, because one of the biggest things about encampment is teamwork. So if you're not working with your team, then you're most likely gonna fail. There were some people in encampment when I went that didn't make it all the way through. So you'll just have to kind of introduce yourself because they're the people that you're gonna be with for the next week.
Encampment is like, go ahead. But what I was saying was like encampment is like you're gonna deal with mostly all types of people. It's kind of like, you know, creating a network. Like you're connecting with like, you know, different types of people from different counties, different squadrons, probably different states. So, because I met a few people who were from Pennsylvania, two from New York. Don't remember their names, obviously. It's been years ago, so. I can tell you though that during encampment from 2011, you're definitely going to take a lot of, you're going to get a taste of, I think, almost every branch. Like the Coast Guard, you know, you have like a little course, obstacle course where you get to like, you know, not explain this, but it's like kind of like one of those like football practices where you got to run through the cones and stuff and you get sprayed on. As well, you have the other obstacle course by the Army where it's kind of like you're in the woods and you're like, you know, walking in overlaid woods, using ropes, you know, like it's kind of like, you ever seen that shows of Ninja Warrior or those different types of obstacles as well? You got the teamwork, you use the barrels to get through lakes, the logs, branches, etc. As well, you get like the taste of food of MREs, and the taste might be off, but I promise you won't be using the bathroom for 2 days after you eat those. As far as like PT goes, you're waking up at like around 3 or 4 a.m. It's a little nerve-wracking at first because it's nothing like what you would expect when you wake up. It's kind of like you just hear someone like blowing a loud speaker with metal music, or someone hitting like a recycling can. So, other than that, you will get a taste of oak lights. You will get to tour around maybe helicopters, aircrafts. They'll go to the cafeteria. They do have like a Sunday mass. They definitely have airspace education, leadership course. You'll get a lot of taste out of it. You meet a lot of good people, which create memories.
Somebody asked how long is the encampment. The encampment is 8 days. You report on a Saturday and you graduate the following Saturday. Like your flight commander say, it's going to be a good experience. A lot of people at the beginning, you know, we always have the first 2 days people who want to go call home. They want to call mom because they are not used to it. But just always remember, when you go to encampment and they assign you into a flight, just look who's next to you. The person in front of you, the person behind you, the person who to your left and to your right. If they get up every morning and they there, that's your team. You gotta do your stuff and be part of that team. So ask your questions now. That's why this is the time for the cadets. Anything they gotta do with the cadet program, this is your time. So ask any question that you have that you want to know, and so we can get you squared away. Back to the flight commander, first sergeant.
So on that note, do you have anything else for the cadets so that they may be dismissed?
Yeah, I don't have nothing for the cadets, so nobody got nothing for the cadets. Lieutenant Fielas, if you don't have nothing, you can let your flight commander, first sergeant know that you're done with them, and you can let the cadets dismiss the cadets.
Everything is good. We're good to go.
All right, this concludes your squadron meeting for this week. Bye, guys. We'll see you next week.